Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a subject so vast,
Mhm.
so willfully complicated that his career doesn't really look like a smooth highway. It's more like a mountain range formed by, constant tectonic shifts.
Exactly.
We are unpacking Bob Dylan, the singular figure who has spent, 68 active years just completely redefining what popular music and poetry and even persona can mean.
And when you, the learner, look at the sheer volume of material we are distilling today, I mean, we're
Mhm.
talking 39 studio albums, 18 volumes of the Bootleg series, which are crucial,
They're crucial.
plus films, memoirs, a massive body of visual art. The mission for us is really clear. It's not just about documenting the history, it's about trying to understand the blueprint of his genius.
Yes, exactly. We're tracking those deliberate reinventions, the moments where Dylan just completely defied expectations and often, alienated his core audience in the process.
Hmm.
We really need to figure out why he pivots so dramatically. From protest folk idol to electric rock god, from a secular bard to a gospel evangelist, and then from musician to painter and sculptor. These shifts, they're the real engine of his creativity.
We're basically providing a necessary roadmap through all these complex decades, and we have to highlight right up front the ultimate validation of his literary ambition, which is the 2016 Nobel Prize in Literature.
I mean, that's just incredible.
It was awarded for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition, making him, groundbreakingly, the first musician ever to receive that honor.
Okay, so let's unpack that cultural identity right at the very beginning. He was born Robert Allen Zimmerman, May 24th, 1941, in Duluth, Minnesota. A detail that often gets lost in all the mythology is that his Hebrew name is Shabtai Zizel ben Avraham.
Right.
And he's become one of the best-selling musicians globally. I think the estimate is around 125 million records sold worldwide.
But if we just focus on the sales figures, we're really missing the heart of the matter. His core identity lies in the literary complexity he injected into pop culture.
Yeah.
He was taking these sophisticated lyrical techniques that you'd associate with the intellectualism of classic literature and poetry and, injecting them right into 3-minute songs.
And that made his work immediately relevant to the burgeoning counterculture, while at the same time it set the stage for his lifelong project, which seems to be constantly changing lanes just to avoid being captured.
So let's start in the Midwest. Robert Zimmerman, he spends his childhood in Hibbing, Minnesota, as part of a really close-knit Jewish community. He even had his bar mitzvah in 1954. So before he becomes this, voice of protest, what were the first musical and cultural sparks that really ignited him?
Well, his early influences were actually far broader than his later folk persona would suggest. He was completely captivated by the radio.
He talked about listening to the Grand Ole Opry and the sound of Hank Williams, and he described it as going through me like an electric rod. He was also drawn to singers with a really unique delivery, like Johnny Ray. He said he was the first singer whose voice and style he totally fell in love with.
To the point of wanting to look like him.
Exactly, even emulating his look.
And as a teenager, he was. He was fully plugged into the electric current of the era. He wasn't playing folk ballads. He was rocking out to Little Richard and Elvis Presley. He was in high school bands with names like the Golden Chords.
Yeah, and he was reportedly so loud at a school talent show that the principal actually had to cut the microphone feed.
I love that.
But that youthful rock energy, it found a defining focus in 1959. And Dylan cited this moment in his Nobel lecture, which gives it this real historical weight.
Right.
On January 31st, just 4 days before his death, Dylan, who was 17 at the time, saw Buddy Holly perform at the Duluth Armory. And Dylan later described Holly as the archetype, everything I wasn't and wanted to be. That really confirmed his path toward performance and musical ambition.
But that rock and roll path,
Yeah.
it ended up proving too shallow for him, didn't it? The critical shift came when he enrolled at the University of Minnesota in '59. He started viewing rock as just great catchphrases and driving pulse rhythms.
Yeah.
He needed something with more substance.
Precisely. He discovered folk music, and he explained this pivot in a lot of detail. He felt folk was more of a serious type of thing. He sought out songs filled with more despair, more sadness, more triumph, more faith in the supernatural, much deeper feelings.
So this was an intellectual commitment. It was a way for him to elevate his own songwriting beyond what he saw as the triviality of commercial rock.
Yes, and central to that commitment was shedding that Robert Zimmerman identity and adopting a new persona. He experimented a bit, briefly calling himself Elston Bunn, then Dylan, before he settled on Dylan.
And he later denied that the poet Dylan Thomas was the direct inspiration. He famously joked that Thomas's poetry was for people who weren't satisfied in bed.
Right, but it was still this essential act of self-creation.
That transformation was so critical. The name allowed him to build the myth from the ground up. And that persona was cemented when he legally changed his name to Robert Dylan in August of 1962.
And by January 1961, the die was cast. He dropped out of college and headed straight for New York City, determined to visit his ailing idol, Woody Guthrie, who was hospitalized over in New Jersey.
That journey wasn't just about moving geographically, was it? It was more like a spiritual pilgrimage. He called Guthrie the true voice of the American spirit. And he just immersed himself in the Greenwich Village folk circuit, absorbing lessons from everyone. Dave Van Ronk, the Clancy brothers, basically learning the trade of a traditionalist.
And his ascent was just incredibly rapid once he landed. He was signed to Columbia Records, championed by the legendary producer John Hammond. His 1962 debut album, Bob Dylan, it was mostly covers of traditional material. It only had 2 originals, and it sold really poorly. I think barely 5,000 copies in the first year. It was a very humble start, but, he got his foot in the door.
But that initial sort of quiet success, that proved to be a cage for him, didn't it? The breakthrough that really established his lyrical and cultural reputation came the very next year with the freewheelin' Bob Dylan.
That album was the launchpad. It featured Blowin' in the Wind, a song whose melody, was derived from the traditional slave song No More Auction Block, and The Times They Are A-Changin', which he wrote explicitly to be a theme song for the civil rights and folk movements.
And just like that, he was suddenly canonized as the protest poet.
And that canonization, that branding as the voice of his generation, was something he almost immediately started to rebel against.
Yeah, the sources suggest he found that title manipulative and really constraining. It felt like he was a product owned by the movements that were championing him.
And his rise was accelerated enormously thanks to Joan Baez. She became his primary advocate and his lover. She recorded his songs. She consistently invited him to join her on stage during her own much larger concerts.
Right, she was exposing him to these mass audiences who just instantly embraced the idea of Dylan as their political standard bearer.
Yet, we see his independent streak, that refusal to be boxed in, surface almost immediately. In May of '63, he was scheduled to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, but the CBS executives demanded that he censor his song, Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues.
And he just walked. He refused to comply.
That established a crucial precedent really early in his career. He would answer to no executive, no movement, no external authority when it came to his creative output.
That refusal to be pigeonholed is what set the stage for his next radical shift. By 1964, with the album Another Side of Bob Dylan, he was actively turning away from those topical, serious protest songs. He started writing these dense, impressionistic lyrical masterpieces like Chimes of Freedom, a style Allen Ginsberg famously called chains of flashing images. And he explicitly rejected that political role in songs like It Ain't Me, Babe.
And this internal artistic shift, it was accompanied by a physical transformation. He started shedding the folksy jeans and work shirts and adopting this high-fashion Carnaby Street wardrobe, complete with the ever-present sunglasses and pointed beetle boots.
He was visually preparing to sever his ties with the folk movement.
The stage was set. The transformation from this earnest folk disciple to an electric rock artist happened with, shocking speed and controversy. It all began with bringing it all back home in early 1965.
Which featured his very first electric recordings, produced by Tom Wilson.
And that opening track, Subterranean Homesick Blues, was a sonic declaration of war on expectation. The lyrics were this dizzying stream of consciousness, owing something to Chuck Berry's quick-fire delivery, but just steeped in the anarchic energy of beat poetry.
And it's now seen by critics as a direct forerunner of rap and hip-hop.
Oh, for sure.
That rapid-fire delivery and that whole persona were brilliantly captured in the documentary Don't Look Back. It opens with that iconic sequence for the song where Dylan just holds up and drops cue cards instead of lip-syncing.
Which was an immediate, almost accidental invention of the modern music video format.
But the real cultural conflict, the moment the folk world felt completely betrayed, happened in July 1965 at the Newport Folk Festival.
Right.
Dylan walks onto the stage for his first electric set since high school, backed by a pickup group that included Mike Bloomfield. And he was met not just with noise, but with an ideological rupture.
Let's talk about that rupture, because it wasn't just about the volume. Critics often describe it as simple booze, but it exposed this really deep ideological rift between the traditionalists and the modernists.
It was a betrayal of the promise of folk music. For people like Pete Seeger, folk music was a communal acoustic tool for social change. By plugging in, Dylan was seen as moving from political seriousness to, commercial rock stardom.
The traditionalist Ewan MacColl later famously slammed the performance. He called it 10th-rate drivel that only a completely non-critical audience could have fallen for.
So the boos were not just sound quality complaints, they were cries of Judas, even before that famous 1966 shout.
And Dylan's response was immediate and just scathing. Only 4 days later in the studio, he recorded Positively 4th Street, which is this scorched earth anthem of vengeance and paranoia aimed squarely at the folk community.
It was interpreted as a definitive put-down of those former friends who had criticized his artistic evolution.
This whole whirlwind of confrontation really peaked during the 1966 Europe tour, which is captured in stunning detail in the various bootlegs and later documentary footage. The infamous confrontation happened at the Manchester Free Trade Hall, though for a long time it was mistakenly attributed to the Royal Albert Hall.
The emotional weight of that moment is just immense.
Yeah.
When the fans scream Judas, the ultimate accusation of betrayal, Dylan turns, he pauses, and then he delivers that unforgettable retort. I don't believe you. You're a liar.
And then he whips his backing band, the Hawks, who would soon become the band with the command, "Play it fucking loud."
That single moment cemented his image as the defiant, unassailable artist.
And creatively, that period between 1965 and 1966 was his zenith. We see it in the album Highway 61 Revisited, which was named after the highway that runs from his birthplace in Minnesota all the way down to New Orleans.
And central to that album was Like a Rolling Stone, a 6-minute single that just absolutely obliterated the commercial standard for pop songs. It wasn't just long, it was abrasive, it was dense, and it was instantly iconic.
Right. Rolling Stone magazine named it the greatest song of all time. Bruce Springsteen perfectly articulated its power. He said the moment that snare drum hit, it sounded like somebody kicked open the door to your mind.
This astonishing creative burst then culminated in the double album Blonde on Blonde in 1966. Dylan called the resulting sound, what was it? That thin, wild Mercury sound.
Yeah, but what did that actually entail, technically?
Well, we hear the phrase a lot, but it describes a really radical technical pivot. The sources indicate that Dylan was trying to merge the complexity of New York's lyrical depth with the raw spontaneity of Nashville's session players.
Right, and those Nashville musicians, guys like Charlie McCoy, they were highly professional, but were, typically unfamiliar with rock and roll or with Dylan's spontaneous, constantly evolving arrangements.
So the producer, Bob Johnston, he just decided to embrace that lack of preparation. They would rehearse a song briefly, sometimes just once, and then immediately record the take.
This forced spontaneity, combined with long recording sessions and Al Cooper's unique organ work, created that chaotic, layered, yet highly structured sound. It was the quintessential New York hipster merged with country music efficiency.
And then, just as he achieved peak fame, radio silence. The July 1966 motorcycle crash near his home in Woodstock. He crashed his Triumph Tiger 100. And while the physical damage was real, he claimed to have broken several vertebrae. The specifics were just shrouded in mystery. There was no ambulance, no immediate hospitalization.
Well, biographers universally agree the circumstances were intentionally ambiguous. It provided the perfect, indisputable opportunity for him to retreat from the intense pressures of fame and the relentless touring schedule.
He admitted it himself. He said, "Truth was that I wanted to get out of the rat race." And this accident kicked off a hiatus from touring that would end up lasting nearly 8 years.
During his seclusion, while he was recovering and editing that rejected film of his '66 tour, Eat the Document, he was recording casually in the basement of the Hawks' nearby house, Big Pink.
Right. These were acoustic, intimate sessions, initially just demos for other artists.
And this is a crucial piece of music history. These 100-plus songs, recorded purely for fun and experimentation, inadvertently created the modern bootleg industry.
How so?
When these unauthorized raw acoustic tapes leaked and were released as Great White Wonder in 1969, featuring 7 of those basement tracks, it was a massive cultural statement.
And why was that leak so pivotal beyond just the songs themselves?
Because it offered a raw, acoustic, unvarnished alternative to the highly commercialized, overproduced rock of the late 60s, epitomized by bands like Cream and stadium rock in general.
Right.
Great White Wonder offered authenticity and simplicity. It established this idea that fans could and should consume and circulate music outside the official corporate industry channels, and that directly fed the counterculture's anti-establishment ethos.
And Columbia eventually had to respond by releasing a curated selection as the Basement Tapes in 1975.
His formal return to the official recording studio was with the sparse, intentionally biblical album John Wesley Harding in 1967, which included All Along the Watchtower.
A song that found its definitive interpretation somewhere else. Dylan himself acknowledged that Jimi Hendrix's cover, which came out just months later, effectively took ownership of the song.
Yeah, that's a rare instance of Dylan being completely eclipsed by an interpreter.
He wrapped up the decade in 1969 by embracing yet another genre of cut country. Nashville Skyline featured a strikingly mellow, newly clear-voiced Dylan, signaling a kind of domestic calm. It had a duet with Johnny Cash on Girl from the North Country and the hit single Lay Lady Lay. This shift was hugely influential. It gave a big boost to the nascent country rock genre.
So by the end of the 60s, Dylan had fully established the pattern we still see today. The only way for him to remain relevant was to constantly shed the skin of his previous success.
Moving into the 70s, Dylan's career really became a roller coaster of critical opinion and output. It kicked off with the controversial Self-Portrait in 1970, which was this rambling double album with mostly covers and very few originals.
The reception was vicious. The critic Greil Marcus famously opened his review by asking, "What is this shit?"
Oh.
Yet, Dylan quickly pivoted again. He released New Morning later that same year, which was widely seen as a decisive return to form. And this inconsistency, brilliant peaks alongside just baffling choices, that became the signature of the decade for him.
But amongst the chaos, there was true genius. Blood on the Tracks from 1975 is now unanimously regarded as one of his greatest achievements. It was recorded during his painful estrangement and eventual divorce from his first wife, Sarah Lowndes.
What's so fascinating here is the sheer meticulousness and self-doubt that surrounded its production. Dylan was so concerned that he actually delayed the release, flew back to Minneapolis to re-record half the songs with local musicians.
And his brother, David Zimmerman, helped out.
Right. And the contrast between the initial raw New York recordings and the Minneapolis polish is a study in creative insecurity masking just immense quality.
And the result was spectacular. The journalist Bill Wyman called it his only flawless album, noting its sublime balance between the dense stream of consciousness narratives of the mid-60s and the simpler, more melodic compositions he would later pursue.
It just captured raw emotional turmoil through highly structured poetry.
Following that masterpiece, he launched the grand spectacle of the Rolling Thunder Revue from 75 to 76. This was like a traveling circus of artists Joan Baez, Joni Mitchell, Allen Ginsberg.
Yeah, performing in these small halls, often unannounced, designed to recapture the spontaneity of a traveling medicine show.
That spontaneity translated into a sprawling, messy, yet fascinating film, Ronaldo and Clara from 1978, which Dylan directed and starred in. It was critically savaged at the time, though now it's viewed as a pretty unique artistic document.
The subsequent 1978 world tour was massive and highly commercial. He performed 114 shows, grossed over $20 million. But visually and orally, critics just dismissed it as a Las Vegas tour.
Right, with backup singers and polished arrangements.
Dylan, characteristically candid, told the Los Angeles Times he needed the money desperately due to accumulated debts from the costly movie and a particularly costly California divorce.
Okay, so if the electric conversion was radical, then the next pivot was truly seismic. Let's discuss the Christian trilogy. In the late 70s, Dylan underwent this profound spiritual change, converting to evangelical Christianity and attending extensive Bible study classes.
And this immediately manifested in his work, leading to 3 consecutive albums of contemporary gospel music. It started with Slow Train coming in 1979. It was critically polarizing but commercially successful, and it won him a Grammy for the hit Gotta Serve Somebody.
The recording sessions themselves are famous. You have the legendary producer Jerry Wessler, a self-described 62-year-old Jewish atheist, trying to record this new material.
And Wexler's account of Dylan trying to evangelize him during the sessions is a wonderful anecdote. It just captures the sincerity of Dylan's conviction at the time.
What does he say?
Wexler recanted essentially having to tell Dylan, "Bob, I appreciate the enthusiasm, but let's stick to making the album." The intensity of Dylan's faith, it wasn't just in the studio, it was on the road.
And that's where the massive backlash came from. On tour, Dylan completely refused to play his secular hits. He delivered these lengthy onstage sermons preaching about judgment and salvation.
And alienating legions of fans who were hoping for Blowin' in the Wind or like a Rolling Stone.
The reaction was severe. He was seen as a fanatic. Even his peers reacted. John Lennon, who was just emerging from his own 5-year seclusion, recorded the song Serve Yourself in direct response to Dylan's hit.
A clear counter-argument to the evangelism.
The shift back towards secular material was gradual, though, which eased the tension. Shot of Love in 1981 contained the first non-gospel compositions in years, mixed alongside his Christian songs.
This album, despite the mixed reviews for the whole trilogy, delivered some of his finest late-period writing. Every Grain of Sand, for instance, was highly praised by artists like Elvis Costello as potentially Dylan's best song.
Why that one?
It contains these deeply contemplative, almost William Blake-esque lyrics about faith and doubt that appealed even to non-believers.
The mid-'80s are often characterized by critics as a period of, well, significant career fluctuations and, frankly, carelessness. A notable example is his 1983 album Infidels.
Yes, Infidels is notorious because of the tracks that were left off. It's almost universally agreed that some of the most magnificent songs he recorded during those sessions, including Blind Willie McTell, a haunting, powerful tribute to the blues musician, were just shelved.
And they only surfaced later in the Bootleg series. It just demonstrates a puzzling lack of quality control at the time.
That period sort of culminated in his appearance at Live Aid in 1985. The music itself was, passable. He was backed by Keith Richards and Ronnie Wood, but the moment is remembered solely for his political improvisation.
He drew immediate criticism by suggesting that aid money should be diverted to pay American farmers' mortgages.
And while the comment was criticized as misplaced, it had tangible, immediate resonance. It directly inspired Willie Nelson to launch Farm Aid, which shows Dylan's continued power to spark major cultural initiatives, even unintentionally.
Despite fluctuating album sales, his collaborative star power remained high. In 1988, he co-founded the supergroup The Traveling Wilburys with George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, Roy Orbison, and Tom Petty.
The July 1 album was a massive hit, reaching number 3 in the U.S., and the songs themselves were described as Dylan's most accessible and melodically simple in years. He seemed to be enjoying the camaraderie and the shared spotlight, rather than the pressure of being the sole voice.
And he ended the decade on a serious high note, effectively establishing the ground zero for his big resurgence with the 1989 Daniel Lanois-produced album, Oh Mercy.
Oh Mercy was a critical smash. It was praised for its dark, swampy soundscape and its lyrical cohesiveness. Lanois' production style, which favored atmosphere and deep texture over polish, helped draw a new, distinct vocal performance from Dylan.
Critics hailed it as the nearest thing to a great Bob Dylan album in the 1980s, and it really set the table for the next 3 decades of triumph.
The 1990s began slowly with the uneven album Under the Red Sky, but Dylan quickly corrected course by doubling down on his traditional roots.
Right, he released 2 albums of folk and blues covers, Good As I've Been to You in '92, backed only by his acoustic guitar. He was reconnecting with the very tradition he had once so publicly abandoned.
The decade was interrupted by a truly frightening health crisis in 1997. He was hospitalized with pericarditis, caused by histoplasmosis, a really serious fungal infection.
He recovered swiftly, but his famous quote upon release really stuck. He really thought I'd be seeing Elvis soon.
And that near-death experience seems to have fueled his creative urgency, leading to the formal, critically undeniable comeback, Time Out of Mind in 1997.
This was his first collection of original material in 7 years, and it was widely acclaimed for its morbid ruminations and its bitter, weary assessments of mortality and love.
It was a massive statement and a huge critical triumph. It won the Grammy Award for Album of the Year. Tracks like Not Dark Yet and Make You Feel My Love became instant standards.
And it signaled the beginning of what we now recognize as his third major creative peak, often characterized by that reflective late-night poetry.
The 21st century then brought a string of long overdue, massive accolades that confirmed his mainstream recognition finally matched his critical reverence.
He won an Academy Award for Best Original Song, Things Have Changed, in 2001, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2012, with President Obama calling him a bigger giant in the history of American music.
And his creative hot streak continued, forming what critics now call the late career trilogy: Time Out of Mind, Love and Theft from 2001, and Modern Times in 2006. All were highly praised, continuing his exploration of the American songbook and classical blues traditions.
But despite the high praise, sources are always frank about the vocal changes. His voice had coarsened significantly. One critic even referred to it as a guitaral death rattle.
That's true, but that gravelly texture actually served the material. It transformed him from a young, nasal protest singer into this grizzled, authoritative blues bard. It lent authenticity and weight to his late career explorations of time, history, and regret.
But the triumphs weren't only musical. He expanded his profile in fascinating and truly unpredictable ways. From 2006 to 2009, he hosted Theme Time Radio Hour on XM Satellite Radio.
A weekly show that was lauded for its eclectic music choices and Dylan's unexpected personality, his humor, his quirky stories.
That show was an insight into the non-singing mind of Dylan. It revealed his vast musical knowledge. He even briefly resurrected it in 2020 for a special episode focusing entirely on whiskey.
Which is conveniently tied to his own commercial venture, the Heaven's Door whiskey line.
And he entered the literary world in earnest. His memoir Chronicles, Volume 1 from 2004, brilliantly confounded expectations. Instead of detailing the famous mid-60s period, it focused heavily on his lean years in 61 and 62, and then two disparate later periods, 1970 and 1989.
It really acted as a highly curated piece of performance art in memoir form.
And then in 2022, he published The Philosophy of Modern Song, a collection of 66 eclectic essays analyzing other artists' songs. It's a work that cements his view that songwriting is a high form of literature, capable of sustaining serious philosophical critique.
This brings us to a major contradiction that needs unpacking, though. It's difficult to reconcile the protest poet who refused to censor Talking John Birch in 1963 with the modern artist who fully embraced commercialism.
So how do the sources explain this commercial pivot?
Well, it's a classic Dylan paradox. Some critics view it cynically as just late career profiteering, but others argue that by the 2000s, Dylan had transcended the notion of selling out.
How so?
By appearing in ads for Victoria's Secret or the Cadillac Escalade or that controversial 2014 Chrysler 200 Super Bowl ad where he used surprisingly protectionist language, "We will build your car," he was sort of satirizing the consumer culture he was participating in.
So maintaining his critical distance while cashing the checks.
Exactly. He was using the medium to deliver an artistic message, however short and strange.
That calculated ambiguity brings us to the ultimate recognition, the Nobel Prize. When it was awarded in 2016 for having created new poetic expressions within the great American song tradition, the New York Times called it perhaps the most radical choice in Nobel history.
And the mechanism of this poetic expression is key here. The Swedish Academy fundamentally legitimized the song lyric as literature.
Right.
Dylan took folk meter, that simple structure inherited from ballads and blues, and fused it with dense literary devices. Internal rhyme schemes, sophisticated metaphor, complex allusion, and a stream of consciousness narrative density that just hadn't been seen in popular music before.
And the Nobel lecture he eventually delivered, after a period of classic Dylan silence, provided his own artistic context. He discussed his early influences, he stressed the importance of Buddy Holly and the debt he owed to tradition, but he never actually performed a song.
The academic acceptance is now total. I mean, the Harvard professor Richard F. Thomas has studied Dylan's entire catalog in the context of classical literature, placing him in the tradition of epic poets like Virgil and Homer.
So the structure of Dylan's narrative, his use of persona, his deep engagement with foundational myths, they're now analyzed on the same level as ancient texts.
The sheer monetary value of his catalog is also just astonishing. His handwritten lyrics for Like a Rolling Stone fetched $2 million at auction in 2014, a record at the time for a popular music manuscript.
And then in 2020, he took perhaps the most definitive commercial step of his career, selling his entire song catalog, both publishing and copyright control, to Universal Music Publishing Group for an estimated $300 to $400 million.
A massive move that ensures his creative output is institutionalized.
And that institutionalization leads to a fascinating contradiction for an anti-establishment figure. His massive archive of 6,000 items, notebooks, drafts, films, was sold and is now housed in the Bob Dylan Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which opened in 2022.
Right.
So is the artist who once championed the counterculture, now effectively institutionalizing his own myth. And what does that centralized archive mean for future scholarship?
It means that the myth is now controllable. For an artist whose career was built on circulating bootlegs and defying corporate systems, placing his entire working life in a single controlled environment is a powerful final act of curation.
It dictates how history will view him.
Exactly. It transforms the messy reality of his career into a neat academic narrative, complete with official exhibits and controlled access.
We also need to recognize Dylan as a serious visual artist. He's transitioned seamlessly into painting, drawing, and sculpture. His work, like the Drawn Blank series, has been exhibited in major galleries globally since 2007.
And he specializes in wrought iron work for his sculptures, creating pieces like the Seven Iron Gates in the Mood Swings exhibit and the permanent monumental archway, Portal, at the MGM National Harbor.
And even in this visual sphere, controversy follows. His art has drawn fire for his practice of using photographs, sometimes by masters like Henri Cartier-Bresson, as sources for his paintings.
It's a complex debate. While some critics called it plagiarism, others defended the practice as a common and accepted element of art history, particularly in the tradition of appropriation and collage.
He's pushing the boundaries of what constitutes original creation in visual art, just as he did in songwriting.
And just to prove that even simple authentication can be messy, in 2022, he had to issue a rare public apology for using an auto pin to sign books and artwork that had been sold since 2019 as genuinely hand-signed.
So even at 80, the business of Dylan remains fraught with tension.
Through all these creative and commercial shifts, there is one constant: the never-ending tour. It began on June 7, 1988, and he has maintained a grueling schedule, often playing 100 dates a year, surpassing 3,000 shows.
And for you, the listener, this tour is where the tension between legend and performance truly lives. He notoriously alters the arrangements and changes his vocal approach so drastically that critics are completely divided.
Yeah, some argue he's successfully keeping his rich legacy alive by finding new ways to inhabit the songs.
While others argue the songs are rendered unrecognizable, often forcing the audience to grapple with a version of the song they barely recognize. He demands that the audience work, rather than simply offering comfortable nostalgia.
And currently, he's in the Rough and Rowdy Ways Worldwide Tour, which runs from 2021 to 2025, focusing heavily on songs from his 39th studio album, Rough and Rowdy Ways.
And even now, in his 80s, the only constant is that the show keeps going, with dates already announced for 2026. #tag outro.
So, what does this extraordinary, complex journey truly mean?
We have tracked Robert Zimmerman, the Jewish kid from Hibbing, who mastered folk and then exploded it, who embraced faith and then returned to the American Songbook, continually confounding, frustrating, and inspiring millions. His story is one of continually and sometimes angrily rejecting the boxes the world tried to put him in, even when those boxes were built for him by his own devoted followers.
His ultimate legacy is tied to that restless artistic ambition. He is the artist who took the framework of popular song and injected it with profound intellectual ambition, forcing the culture to recognize the folk tradition as capable of tackling political, social, and philosophical concepts at the highest level.
The continuous reinvention, that refusal to be static, is what guarantees his relevance. It ensures that every generation and every listener has a different, sometimes conflicting, but always compelling version of Bob Dylan to grapple with.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the learner. Alex Ross summarized Dylan's ongoing career perfectly, noting that his continued activity forces listeners to constantly think again.
Let's revisit the sale of Blowin' in the Wind in 2022.
Right. This was a singular, one-of-one musical artifact. For a man whose entire career has been about mass circulation, cheap bootlegs, and easily reproduced recordings, he created a unique recording using what's called ionic original technology.
And can you explain what that is? Because
Yeah.
it's not a vinyl record.
No, it's not. Ionic Original is a proprietary technology developed by T-Bone Burnett. It involves engraving a recording onto an aluminum disc, then coating it in lacquer, creating a single archival-grade physical analog copy that is non-duplicable.
So it functions as a unique piece of sound art, like a single sculpture.
Exactly. And that single artifact sold for nearly $1.8 million at auction.
So what does it mean for an artist whose history is defined by the democratic, reproducible nature of the record and the bootleg to create an irreplaceable, singular object of sound?
It's the ultimate artistic statement about legacy and value. Even as the digital age attempts to pin music down and make it infinitely reproducible, Dylan, in his 9th decade, created a definitive, non-circulating physical expression of his most famous song. It's a testament to the fact that for the architect of American song, the only constant right up until the end is change, even if that change means transforming mass culture into singular art.
Thank you for diving deep with us.